Um, let's see. So it's 12:05 over there right now. So I'm going to be talking a little bit fast, and I normally talk fast. So if things get confusing, I'm going to blame the time and not myself. So I'm going to open with a little bit of preliminaries about Batak and PMP, and then discuss sources of palatals in the Batak languages, and then we'll go through the palatals one by one, and then I'll close with some discussion. And just to make sure, everything good?
Yes, we can hear
Good.
you. Great, thanks.
Okay, great. Okay, so the Batak languages are a subgroup of Austronesian, actually a further down subgroup of Sumatran. There are about 9 languages. They're the vertical striped ones up here in the north end of Sumatra. And the most recent and most thorough historical work that was done with the Batak languages was carried out by Adelar in 1981, who reconstructed the Proto Batak phonology and some lexical items and showed how the languages split up neatly into 2 branches, a northern and a central southern branch. Okay, so that's a very brief overview of the Batak languages, and then an even briefer overview of PMP phonology. We'll be looking at the phonological inventory for Proto-Malayo-Polynesian, specifically with the palatal consonant contrast, so the voiceless affricate, the voiced affricate, and the nasal. So,
Blaine, we can't actually see the slide progression. We still just see your title slide.
oh no. Okay. How's this? Is this better?
Yes, we're there. Thank you.
Okay, so I won't be able to go into presentation mode then, but this should be fine. So this was the map with the stripey. So those are the Batak languages. This is the phonological inventory of PMP, and we're going to be looking at these 3 reconstructed phonemes. And then here are some quotes that I'm just going to gloss over, but needless to say, what I'm getting at here on this slide is that the Batak languages have been used as a diagnostic for reconstructing the voiced and voiceless palatal affricates for PMP, not the nasal. So I'm only going to be touching very briefly on the nasal. Okay, so if we think about sources of palatals in these 4 languages, you can have one of 4 possible cases. Either there's no clear etymology and no clear donor language, in which case you have innovations, or you have no clear donor but a clear etymology, in which case you have retentions, or you have a donor and no clear etymology, in which case you have loans, or you have both a clear donor and a clear etymology, in which case it could be either a retention or a loan, and the item must be disambiguated by your normal retentions and your normal loans. Okay. For the purposes of this presentation, we're not going to care about these 2 intersections. So we're really only caring about all the palatals, that's this row, in the Batak languages, and all those that have a PMP etymology. So this is going to be these 2 columns. Okay, so there are 3 possible intersection cases for sources of palatals. Okay, I just went over like a donor language versus PMP language versus inheritance, but now this is going to be retentions versus loans. So the first case is that all the palatals from PMP were retained. So this is where here you have the PMP etymologies, so the retentions, you have donor language loans, and then any that's possibly an intersection is ambiguous for it being a retention or a loan. And then you also have innovations, but these aren't really a concern because at no point in the transition from PMP to Proto Batak would you say that the palatals went away, because if they were always retained, you could always innovate palatals again. Like keep re-innovating lexical items that had palatals. Okay, the second option is that the palatal was not retained. So this would be, for example, if the palatal nasal merged with the alveolar nasal. So you would have a retention of a non-palatal from PMP, and you would have loans of palatal nasals from donor languages. And then whenever you have a possible donor or possible etymology, this can be disambiguated by if it has a palatal nasal, then it must be a loan. If it doesn't have the palatal, then it must be a retention. And then if you have any innovations that have palatal nasals, then there must be some other innovative process to justify it. If you don't have a justification for the innovative palatals, then something's going wrong. Okay, and then the last case is that there was a split. So you have the PMP palatals that became both palatal and non-palatal, in which case everything gets confusing, and we're just not going to be talking about that because I don't want to get into the confusing. Okay. So starting off with the palatal nasal, this is the easiest case for the Batak languages. Step one is to look at the reflexes of PMP palatal nasal. And you don't really have to look over all this data here, but basically all the center columns demonstrate that the palatal nasal from PMP merged with the alveolar nasal in Proto Batak. And this stands in contrast to all the neighboring Malaic languages, which retained palatals. So you can see here, Nyamur was retained as Nyamur, but it became Namur in the Batak languages. Okay, step two is see if there are still other other palatal nasals in the Batak languages. So these would be ones that weren't inherited, but that have been innovated. So those that have no donor and no PMP, we can see some include, and this is just simple nasal substitution. And this is probably a borrowed innovation from nearby Malaic languages, where you have the palatal affricates or the alveolar fricative. Whenever you affix the nasal substitution prefix, these become a palatal nasal. And then other cases of palatal nasals include are going to be transparent loans for so for example, Hanyo, which means only, is a transparent loan from Malaic Hanya, and same for Ternato from Ternata. And then basically the same can be said of alas. You have very transparent loans, but you also have something called nasal spreading, where the nasality from another nasal or from H spreads over to a Y. So whenever affixing an AV prefix onto bayar, you get manyar. Or whenever you have the loan lexical item mayat from Arabic, it becomes manyat in alas. And then in Ankolo Mandailing, you have both nasal substitution and nasal spreading, and you also have transparent loans. So these are all of the cases of the palatal nasal that could have been inherited and that have been since innovated. So are there any conflicts or anything left unexplained? No, because all the possible retentions reflect the alveolar nasal, this is down here. Regular processes account for the innovations, which we discussed on the previous slide, and all remaining cases are clear lone palatal nasals, right? Because if we have something that might have a PMP etymology or might be from a donor language, this can be easily disambiguated because the palatal nasal became the alveolar in the Batak languages, and the surrounding languages only have the palatal in these specific lexical items. So this is case two. The palatal nasal was not retained, and we have a merger of the palatal and alveolar nasal as the alveolar. So I started off with something not controversial, and the next two palatals are going to get gradually more controversial and more complicated. So looking at the voiced palatal affricate. Here again, I just have this gigantic list. You don't need to look at everything. Basically, it's demonstrating that the voiced palatal affricate became the voice alveolar stop in the Batak languages, whereas it was retained in neighboring possible donor languages. Now, in comparison to the palatal nasal, we also have many cases where the opposite is true, that the palatal affricate was retained, right? So you have cases where it merged with the alveolar stop, and cases where it was retained as the alveolar affricate, or as the palatal affricate. Okay, so that doesn't really help us because all these J and D reflexes are ambiguous in all the Batak languages. So now we're going to look at the languages themselves and see which ones have the voice palatal affricate. And as we saw on the previous slide, all of them do. But there's no phonological or phonetic conditioning that would suggest to us which would be a loan and which would be an inheritance. So for example, we have some lexical innovations here that do not appear outside of the Batak subgroup as well as I'm aware. And these are innovated voiced palatal affricates. And we also have phonological innovations developing from PMP lexicon that did not originally have the voiced palatal affricate. And then this stands in contrast to those words that are clear loans. So clear from non-Austronesian languages or from Austronesian languages, borrowing the palatal affricate in. So you have these two sources, native innovations and non-native loans. How does this resolve with the reflexes that we have from PMP? So step three is, do we have any conflicts or anything left unexplained? Yes, because it appears like we have a case three split with no clear criteria on when did the PMP Z become J and when did it become D. So if there's no clear criteria, then is this an unconditioned split, which we would not be wanting, would not be expected anyways. So let's look again at all these lexical items. Nearly all of the PMP Z that reflect J have a clear donor. So for example, PMP Tuju may be retained as Proto Batak Tuju, but also in neighboring Malaic you have Tuju. In addition to this, you have multiple Proto Batak forms that show irregularities for Proto Batak retention, but regularity for Malaic. So for example, in PMP Jalai, which is a type of grain or millet, it became Malaic Anjalai and was imported into Batak Jalai. Now this one is clearly not a Batak native lexical item because you would expect Batak Jalai rather than Jalai with an A. The schwa should have been retained. And then we see this in a couple other lexical items, like the word for blunt, ngajal becomes majal in Malaic. So you have an ang becoming an M, which we see also in the word for young. So this isn't all too strange, I guess, for Malaic. And you have a possible final schwa or A being taken in from Malaic. And that this schwa is possible as a loan from Malaic is clear from the fact that unlikely inheritances and other languages support borrowing of early Malaic close final schwa. And we can get to that in discussion if we want. Okay, so there is clear evidence for a donor J and a PMP-D division, which means that we have case 2, that the palatal Z is not retained, just like with the palatal nasal. And in this case, there was a merger of PMP-D and Z to Proto Batak D. So then what about all of the J innovations? It seems that these phonemes reappeared under pressure from loans from outside languages and via language internal processes. Remember on a couple slides ago, I said that some J's were innovated on PMP words that did not originally have J. Okay, so that's kind of controversial, but this will probably be the more controversial one of the bunch. PMP-C. So here I again have listed out multiple C reflexes for Batak languages, and we see in all of these that C has been retained. The voiceless palatal Africa has been retained in all of them, and same for in Malaic. So that doesn't help us. It's unambiguous in sorry, this is unambiguously C in Northern Batak, S in Southern Batak. So here, unambiguously C in Northern Batak, S in Southern Batak. And then the only exception is that you have NC in Angkola Mandailing, where you would expect NS. So what languages have the palatal affricate? The Northern Batak languages, all of them have it. There are many lexical innovations, and there are also phonological innovations that occurred regularly in certain environments. So T before I and S after N. And this matches with what happened in Angkola Mandailing for the S after N. And then you also have many donor languages again. So from non-Austronesian and Austronesian sources, and this can be compared to exactly what we saw on the previous slides for J. Okay, so are there any conflicts or anything left unexplained? On the surface, no. This looks like a case 1 of retained, right? If we look back at this table, C has been retained in the northern languages, and maybe it merged with S in the southern languages. There doesn't seem to be any conflict between the PMP edema and the donor language loans. Okay, but if we account for the innovations, like S becoming C after N, or T becoming C before I, then we actually only ever find C from a PMP etymology when there's also a donor language. Meaning, inherited C is only ever found in Batak when there is a Malaic cognate, which is strange, right? Why is this concerning? Let's look at some PMP etyma. So this should be a schwa here for the word pacha. This became karo pacha, but the expected phonological form would be the schwa retained rather than it becoming an A, which points to a Malaic loan. For muncung, this could easily be from Proto Batak munsung because S after N became C, or it could just be a Malaic loan. And then this is just another citation in Lusk's online comparative dictionary. Sometimes you even have cases where you have a cited PMP etymology with C, but a Northern Batak S. Okay, so what does this mean for Proto Batak C? We can't really say anything about inheritance, since all inheritances are dubious at best. All inheritances should be considered loans because you have no unambiguous cases of this could not have been inherited from a donor, it could not have been borrowed from a donor language. All other Cs, however, can still be attributed to Proto Batak NS or TI and PNB lexical innovations, and so therefore all non-loan Cs are innovations. Okay, so what does this tell us about Proto Batak palatals? There's no evidence for a phonemic palatal nasal. There's no evidence for a phonemic voiceless palatal affricate, but there is evidence for a voice palatal affricate. And I'll summarize this on the next slide again. And what does this tell us about PMP palatals? Well, the nasals merged, and the Batak cannot be used as evidence for a palatal versus alveolar nasal distinction. And the voiced alveolar stop and the voiced palatal affricate merged. And Batak, again, still cannot be used as evidence for a distinction between the two. And then finally, Batak cannot be used as evidence for C versus S, since there is never a distinction made in clear, non-loaned lexicon. So we have a timeline of changes from PMP, right? So at PMP, you had all three, supposedly, if C is a real constructible phoneme. So at the PMP level, you had all three. By an early Proto-Batak period, these had merged, right? C, it seems it might have merged with S, or it just never existed in the first place. The palatal nasal merged with the alveolar, and the voice palatal stop merged with the voice alveolar. Sorry, the voice palatal affricate voice merged with the voice alveolar stop. And then by the time of Proto-Batak, you have J being re-innovated again. And this is, like I said earlier, probably under influence from loan phonology and language internal processes. And then at a later point, once it's no longer pre-Proto-Batak, but Proto-Batak, C was likely an allophone of S after N. And I have some other evidence for this, but I'm not going into this here because I'm already running up on the time limit. And then how else is this important other than just for Proto-Batak? Well, it provides evidence, one, for Proto-Malaic closed final schwa in Batak loans, which provides evidence for closed final schwa in Proto-Malaic, which has been a debate in Proto-Malaic reconstruction. And then, contrary to the quotes that I showed at the beginning, Batak cannot be used as a diagnostic for Proto-Malayo-Polynesian palatals, unless we're only looking at it specifically for loans. Why? Because the palatals merged with non-palatal segments before Proto-Batak. Okay, that's all I have. I would love all of your questions. Thank you very much for listening to me ramble on. I have some references, and I'm open to whatever.